January 6th, 1942. Less than a month after the shock of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt addresses a stunned nation. He sets a goal that sounds like pure fantasy. America will produce 60,000 aircraft in a single year. To understand the scale of this promise, in all of 1941, the US had built fewer than 6,000 military planes. In Berlin, the news reaches the head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. He is widely reported to have scoffed, declaring the Americans are masters of making only refrigerators and razor blades. From the perspective of the man who built the world's most feared air force, this wasn't a production plan, it was a desperate bluff. This is a story of how that number, 60,000, went from a punchline in Berlin to a production schedule that would decide the air war. A story fought not on the front lines, but on a new kind of battlefield, the assembly line itself.
The question is fundamental. How did the United States, a nation with virtually no experience in the mass production of complex warplanes, build the largest air force the world had ever seen? And why did its enemies, so proud of their own industrial might, so catastrophically fail to see it coming? To understand Göring's confidence, you have to look past the headlines and onto the factory floors of 1940s America. The United States was an industrial titan, but a military pygmy. As Germany's Luftwaffe was rewriting the rules of air power over Europe, the US Army Air Corps was a minor force, possessing fewer than 3,000 aircraft. Many were obsolete trainers and observation planes, unfit for modern combat. The problem wasn't a lack of engineering talent, it was a question of industrial culture. American warplanes were built like exquisite, custom-made watches. At factories for Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated, teams of highly skilled craftsmen assembled each aircraft by hand.
They moved from station to station, fitting, wiring, and riveting with painstaking precision. A single B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, a marvel of engineering, could require over 150,000 man-hours to complete. This was artisanal manufacturing, not mass production. At this rate, building thousands of bombers a year wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. Germany's industry was the mirror opposite.
Honed by the Spanish Civil War and fueled by a total war economy, factories like Messerschmitt and Junkers were churning out thousands of proven, battle-hardened fighters and bombers annually. Their systems were efficient, their supply chains were militarized, and their entire focus was on a single goal: production for conquest. From Berlin, the American aviation industry didn't look like a sleeping giant. It looked like a small, boutique workshop. Here was the fundamental conflict, the detail Göring understood perfectly. America's true industrial genius lay in the mass production of simple, standardized consumer goods. Henry Ford had perfected the art of making millions of identical cars for a mass market. But a four-engine heavy bomber was one of the most complex machines yet conceived by man, with over 300,000 individual parts. The two worlds, the high-volume, low-complexity world of the automobile and the low-volume, high-complexity world of the aeroplane,
seemed utterly incompatible. The existing aircraft industry, with its methods and its culture, could never hope to meet Roosevelt's demand. A radical, almost unthinkable solution was needed, and it would have to come from far outside the world of aviation. The turning point came not in a battle, but in a series of tense meetings in Washington. Realizing the traditional aircraft makers could never meet the numbers, President Roosevelt's administration made a pivotal decision. They looked outside the world of aviation and called on William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to become the president of General Motors. He was a master not of aerodynamics, but of the moving assembly line. Knudsen and his team of Detroit executives, the so-called dollar-a-year men, delivered a blunt and shocking verdict. The existing aircraft industry, with its custom-build culture, simply could not be scaled. Their solution was industrial heresy.
They would not just assist the plane makers, they would, in effect, bypass them. The automobile industry itself would become the prime contractor for America's heavy bombers. The two worlds immediately collided. Aviation engineers who prided themselves on precision craftsmanship were horrified by what they saw as Detroit's crude, high-volume methods. Auto executives, in turn, were baffled by the complex, non-standardized designs of aircraft that seemed to actively resist mass production.
This was the strategic gamble, a forced marriage between two fundamentally opposed industrial philosophies under the immense pressure of a world war. The decision was made. Detroit would build the bombers. The target would not be the sleek B-17, but its younger, more brutish cousin, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. On paper, it was a superior aircraft. It flew faster, farther, and carried a heavier bomb load. But to the automen, its most important feature was its design. Unlike the elegant curved wings of the B-17, the B-24's high, straight Davis wing looked like it could be built in simple modular sections. It was a plane that looked like it wanted to be mass-produced. But looking the part and being the part were two different things. A B-24 was a flying fortress of complexity. Over 10 miles of electrical wiring, thousands of feet of hydraulic tubing, and more than 1 million rivets. Each one had to be placed perfectly. The task of taming this beast fell to one man.
Charles Sorensen, Henry Ford's feared and brilliant production chief. Known as Cast Iron Charlie, his entire career was built on a single, ruthless principle. Any complex process can be broken down into thousands of simple, repeatable steps. In the spring of 1941, Sorensen and a team of Ford engineers descended on the Consolidated Aircraft plant in San Diego. For weeks, they didn't offer advice. They just watched, sketched, and measured, deconstructing not the plane, but the entire process of building it. They ignored the traditions of aircraft craftsmanship. They saw only a puzzle of logistics and motion. By the time they left, they had a radical blueprint to transform the hand-built bomber into a product of the moving assembly line. Their vision would be built in the Michigan countryside, at a place called Willow Run. It was to be the largest factory in the world under a single roof, a physical monument to American industrial ambition.
The plans were staggering. A main building covering 67 acres with an assembly line so vast it had to be built with an L-shaped turn. The goal, stated publicly, was so audacious it bordered on insanity. To assemble a fully equipped, 4-engine heavy bomber ready to fly every 60 minutes. This wasn't just a factory, it was a weapon system in its own right, designed to bury the Axis under the sheer weight of production. But Willow Run, for all its scale, was only the tip of the spear.
The true genius of the American plan, and the detail its enemies would completely miss, was its hidden depth. William Knudson's office in Washington became the nerve centre of a vast, decentralised industrial web. The B-24 was broken down into more than 30,000 parts, and the contracts for those parts were farmed out to the whole of American industry. A General Motors division that once made refrigerators was now manufacturing propellers. The Hoover Company, famous for vacuum cleaners, was tasked with producing control surface components. Small machine shops, furniture makers, and even a pinball machine company were drawn into the orbit of military aviation, each producing a tiny, vital piece of the puzzle. This was the arsenal of democracy, not a single factory, but a chaotic, sprawling, and almost infinitely deep network of thousands of contractors across dozens of states. From Berlin, German intelligence watched this chaotic American effort with a mix of curiosity and contempt.
Their own armaments minister, Albert Speer, was a master of centralised, state-controlled production. Under his efficient top-down direction, German aircraft manufacturing was steadily increasing through 1942 and 1943. The reports from America described a system that seemed, by contrast, amateurish and profoundly wasteful. They read about a car company with zero experience attempting to build one of the world's most complex machines. They saw a messy, inefficient network of civilian companies that had never made a military component in their lives. To the logical, engineering-focused minds of the German war machine, it confirmed every bias. Göring's initial mockery now seemed like sound analysis. The American experiment was too big, too chaotic, and too reliant on amateurs. It couldn't possibly work. The giant factory was built. The thousands of suppliers were contracted. The parts from every corner of the nation began to flow towards Michigan.
But as the colossal machinery of the Willow Run assembly line was switched on for the first time, the entire grand strategy was about to slam into a wall of reality. The reality, in 1943, was catastrophic. The grand vision collapsed into chaos. Parts arriving from the thousands of subcontractors across the country simply didn't fit together. The massive, inexperienced workforce, drawn from all corners of America, was housed in squalid, hastily built settlements, leading to staggering turnover rates, sometimes as high as 100% in a single year. On the factory floor itself, a cultural war erupted. Ford's relentless production men, accustomed to forcing parts into place, clashed with Consolidated's meticulous aircraft engineers, who watched in horror as their complex designs were brutalized. The press, once in awe, turned on the project, coining a new, mocking name, Will It Run? Production fell disastrously behind schedule. The entire American strategic bombing concept, built on the promise of an unstoppable flood of liberators, was on the verge of collapse. In Berlin, it appeared Göring's initial mockery was about to be proven horribly correct. The response was as ruthless as it was decisive. Charles Sorensen and his team descended back onto Willow Run, not as consultants, but as enforcers, managers who couldn't deliver. Were fired on the spot. Complex components that slowed the line were forcibly simplified by Detroit engineers, often over the fierce protests of aviation purists. The factory floor itself was physically reordered, untangling the chaotic flow of materials. For months, the change was agonizingly slow. Then, the system began to learn. The massive workforce stabilized, gaining speed and institutional knowledge. The disciplined supply chain finally delivered parts that fit. Production began to climb. From a handful of planes, the numbers grew exponentially. By the spring of 1944, at its absolute peak, the plant was rolling a fully armed B-24 Liberator off its assembly line every 63 minutes. One factory, a single American factory, was now producing more heavy bombers per month than the entire German aircraft industry combined. The number that Hermann Göring had dismissed as a bluff wasn't the goal anymore. It was a milestone, about to be buried by the unstoppable reality of production. The war on the factory floor had been won. In the end, Roosevelt's impossible number was narrowly missed for 1942, but the system had found its rhythm. The next year, America produced over 85,000 aircraft. In 1944, over 96,000. By the war's end, the total topped 300,000. The laughter in Berlin had turned to stunned silence. This was never just a story about factories. It was a conflict between two industrial philosophies. Germany's system was a precision instrument, centralized, expert-driven, but brittle. America's was a chaotic network, decentralized, competitive, and seemingly inefficient. But its great strength was its capacity to learn from failure and scale exponentially. The war was won not by a superior plan, but by a superior system of production. In the end, the Third Reich, a state built on the myth of its own industrial and military supremacy, was not defeated by a secret weapon. It was broken by the one thing it never took seriously, a Detroit assembly line.